Typically when I talk about every Pokemon game, I just mean the main series games like Pokemon Red and Blue or Pokemon Sword and Shield, but today we're going to go over one fact for every single Pokemon game ever released in chronological order, including all these weird ones, so consider leaving a like and subscribing if you want to support the channel, and let's start things off with the first ever Pokemon game released, Pokemon Red and Green. Pokemon Red and Green released in Japan on February 27th, 1996, which is now known as Pokemon Day. These games differ from Pokemon Red and Blue, which released outside Japan. However, despite being released in 1996, you'll notice that the copyright symbol at the bottom of the title screen for Red and Green says 1995. That's because Pokemon Red and Green were planned to be released in December of 1995, but got delayed a few months until 1996. If you're unaware, in October 1996, Pokemon Blue released as a standalone game. This was an updated version of Pokemon Red and Green which fixed some glitches and updated many sprites, and acted as a framework for Pokemon Red and Blue which were released internationally outside Japan. There's a number of changes in Blue version from Red and Green, like the HP up now being purchasable in the Celadon Department Store, Cerulean Cave having a new simpler layout, and Pokemon like Jynx and Kangaskhan now being available in the wild, which wasn't the case for Red and Green. Another change was the intro, where now you see a Gengar fighting a Jigglypuff. Red and Green had a Nidorino instead of Jigglypuff, but due to a mistake, the Jigglypuff appears as purple because it retains the same color palette as the Nidorino from the previous game. Pokemon Stadium is one of the more popular spin-off games, especially among older Pokemon fans. The original Pokemon Stadium never released outside Japan though, despite having the same name as the regular Pokemon Stadium, and acts more like an early version of Pokemon Stadium that would release internationally. There's only 40 usable Pokemon in this version of Pokemon Stadium, mostly consisting of the final evolution forms of each Pokemon, but they included Pikachu over Raichu. This makes Pikachu the only Pokemon that can evolve to be included in the original Pokemon Stadium game in Japan. Pokemon Yellow released in Japan on September 12, 1998, about 2 weeks before Red and Blue released internationally and acts as the final version of Kanto, on the Game Boy at least. It mostly features some graphical enhancements and overall polish from Blue version, incorporating some elements from the anime like the first partner Pikachu, and encountering the 3 original Kanto starters similar to how Ash would in the anime. Strangely though, in the English and Spanish versions of Yellow, an NPC on the 4th floor of the department store in Celadon City will say how he wants to give a Pokédoll to the copycat in Cerulean City. The copycat really lives in Saffron City though, which the NPC correctly says in the Japanese version as well as the French and Italian versions. Hey You Pikachu was the first Pokemon game released for the N64 outside of Japan and allows you to talk to Pikachu with a microphone. Many people believe that if you say words like Sony or PlayStation that Pikachu will get upset, however that isn't actually the case. If you do call Pikachu an electric rat though, it will be upset. In Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy, Ninetales has its name misspelled as Nine Tails, like the word tail on an animal, in the North American version, however it can be seen spelled correctly in other parts of the game that reference Ninetales. I know Smash Bros isn't technically a Pokemon game, but it does feature a lot of Pokemon. In the first Smash game for N64, Mewtwo was planned to be a playable character but was eventually cut. In Pokemon Snap, there is a cut song called Fantastic Horror that was meant for a level focused on Ghost-type Pokemon. It was cut because of the lack of Ghost-type Pokemon in Generation 1. Now this is where we start to see some of the weird games like Picross NP Volume 1. This was a puzzle game exclusive to Japan on the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom. This released through a Nintendo Power service where you could download the game at a Lawson store across Japan for your Super Nintendo or Super Famicom. The service ran all the way through 2007 though before it was discontinued. Pokemon Pinball for the Game Boy is a unique game that takes its own battery for the Rumble feature to work. If you play this game on the Super Game Boy player for the Super Nintendo though, the Rumble feature won't work. And there are a few localization and spelling errors in the North American version. First, each Pokeball is abbreviated with a letter, but this wasn't updated to reflect their international names, so the Great Ball has an S as its Super Ball in Japan, and the Ultra Ball has an H as its Hyper Ball in Japan. Additionally, Rock Tunnel is referenced as Rock Mountain, and Fuchsia City is misspelled, missing the S. This next Pokemon Stadium game is known as Pokemon Stadium 2 in Japan, not to be confused with the other Pokemon Stadium 2 we'll discuss later. This is a more polished and complete version of the old Japanese Pokemon Stadium, and there's 2 Pikachus in this one even, sort of. If you have a Pikachu from Pokemon Yellow version, it will have a unique voice cry, and also have a different idle animation from a regular Pikachu you'd catch in Red or Blue in Viridian Forest. Pokemon Gold and Silver kicked off the second generation of Pokemon, however out of all of the in-game trades that existed in these games, none of them required the player to trade away a new Pokemon introduced in Generation 2, and all just use Kanto Pokemon, and all the Pokemon that you would receive in the trade are Kanto Pokemon as well. Dance Pikachu was a Japanese arcade game released in 1999. I said every single Pokemon game, so yeah, we're covering these things too. It's a rhythm game that features 5 Pokemon songs. Pokemon Puzzle Challenge was a puzzle game released for the Game Boy Color in 2000. The game was also later released on the 3DS Virtual Console, however multiplayer options were disabled in that version because they were unable to emulate the Game Link cable function on the 3DS. Pokemon Puzzle League is similar to Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, but released for the Nintendo 64 and strangely never released in Japan. Pokemon Stadium 2, or Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver in Japan, was the final Pokemon Stadium game ever released. It's tied with Conker's Bad Fur Day and Resident Evil 2 for being the largest game on the N64 with a file size of 64 megabytes, which is just nothing compared to more modern games. The back of Japanese copies of Pokemon Crystal feature this cool Suicune logo, which unfortunately is absent in international releases of Pokemon Crystal. Pikachu's Great Surfing Adventure was a Japanese exclusive arcade machine that was based on episodes from the Orange Islands anime featuring Lapras. The player controls Lapras across a river collecting as many Pokeballs as possible while avoiding Voltorbs or Whirlpools in your way. Pokemon Trading Card Game 2, The Invasion of Team GR, is a sequel to the Pokemon Trading Card game for Game Boy that was only released in Japan. It came with a promo Lugia card as well as a promo Great Rocket's Mewtwo card, both of which were never released outside of Japan. Pokemon Crayon Kids is another Japanese exclusive arcade machine released in July of 2000, strangely developed by Sega, one of Nintendo's biggest rivals in the 90s. And it just lets you color Pokemon. Super Smash Bros. Melee was released in 2001 for the GameCube, and it's the only GameCube game to be in the Generation 2 cycle of Pokemon and not Generation 3. The Sprout Tower from Gold and Silver was also considered to be made into a stage, but was cut early in development. Now we're getting into a lot of the Pokemon mini-games, which was a Pokemon-only handheld console that resembled a small Game Boy and had a handful of games released for them. I have a full video on this mini-console if you want to see it more in depth, and one of the first games released for it was Pokemon Party Mini, which is a collection of mini-games. Pokemon Zany cards featured card-based games and incorrectly called Nurse Joy, Miss Joy, and Richie, Ricky. Pokemon Pinball Mini features 5 usable Pokemon, all of which have a level based around them where you only use them, except for Wobbuffet. Pokemon Puzzle Collection released worldwide, however it's unknown as to what the exact Australian release date was. Some sources claim it was released on October 3rd, 2001, and other sources say it was released on October 11th, 2002, so all we know is that it was released somewhere within that year or so in Australia. Pokemon Tetris was a collaboration game with Tetris for Pokemon Mini, making it a very strange and rare game. In an interview with Hidenori Kusaka, the author of the Pokemon Adventures manga, he stated how he likes to play Pokemon Tetris from time to time. Pokemon Puzzle Collection Volume 2 was a sequel to Pokemon Puzzle Collection but never released outside of Japan. Pokemon Race Mini was another later release for the Pokemon Mini, only released in Japan, that has very similar gameplay to Pokemon Dash on the Nintendo DS. Pokemon Catch the Numbers was an educational game released on the Sega Pico in Japan. The internal data of this game has a wheezing sprite that is never used in the actual game. The Sega Pico in general is a very weird and interesting console with a lot of these Pokemon games on it that are focused on education. Pichu Bros Mini is another party game released for the Pokemon Mini featuring the Pichu Bros from the Pokemon movies. It can be played with up to 10 players, and I honestly wonder if anyone has ever been able to actually get 10 people to play this game on the Pokemon Mini. Togepi's Great Adventure is another game released for the Pokemon Mini where you have to guide Togepi out of a tower. There really isn't too much information on all of these Pokemon minigames due to how obscure they are and how simple the gameplay is, but I do happen to have the entire North American library in the Chikorita Edition console because I'm an insane Pokemon fan. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were the first Pokemon games released on the Game Boy Advance and were also the first main series games to drop the Gotta Catch 'em All tagline, although early versions of these games' box arts feature the Gotta Catch 'em All slogan. Pokemon Breeder Mini was the final game released for the Pokemon Mini and the only one to feature Generation 3 Pokemon. You can take care of one of the Hoenn starter Pokemon in a Tamagotchi-like minigame. Pokemon Box Ruby and Sapphire is currently one of the rarest and most expensive games in the GameCube library because in North America it was only released on the Pokemon Center's website or in person at the Pokemon Center store in Manhattan. I wish I could have gotten this as a kid, but back then people didn't really buy stuff online nearly as often as you do today, although you could purchase the European or Japanese copies of Pokemon Box for much cheaper. You can even connect your copy of Ruby or Sapphire up with the Game Boy to GameCube cable and play them on the GameCube so long as your cartridge copy matches the language that your Pokemon box is in. So European languages only play European languages, including English of course, and the North American copy only plays North American copies. Pokemon Channel features a lot of minigames that were reused from the Pokemon Mini and also reuses some decorative dolls that you can obtain in Pokemon Stadium 2 to decorate your room. Older versions of Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire were released on the AGB-E06 cartridge, which have battery-backed chips that lose save files when the internal battery runs dry, very similar to the Generation 1 and Generation 2 Pokemon games. This wasn't super common on GBA games, and later versions of Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire remain on the AGB-E11 cartridge, which don't rely on a battery for their save file. Just for fun, I decided to open up my own copy of Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire to see what I have, and I have the newer copy without the battery. I also realized after opening I could have just checked the cartridge from the bottom without opening up to see which model I have. Pokemon Advanced Generation I've Begun Hiragana and Katakana is another learning game for the Sega Pico that helps kids learn Hiragana and Katakana. Pokemon Coliseum feature many Generation 2 Pokemon that can be transferred over Ruby and Sapphire, and even have Kyogre and Groudon on the cover of the game despite neither of those Pokemon being obtainable in the game. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green are remakes of the original Pokemon Red and Blue games that have a lot of small features added to them, like the TGTV, which acts like a tutorial for some basic things in the game. One section of the TGTV explains the key item's pocket and misspells the word pocket by swapping the C and the K. Pokemon Advanced Generation, Pico for Everyone, Pokemon Loud Battle was another learning game on the Sega Pico that came bundled with a very special controller allowing 2 players to play at the same time. In Pokemon Emerald, you can rematch gym leaders, but in the rematches for Roxanne, Flannery, and Winona, their Pokemon will all be male, despite their Pokemon being female in the original first battle. Pokemon Dash is the first Pokemon game released on the Nintendo DS, and it's also the first Pokemon game officially released in Taiwan. Pokepark Fishing Rally DS is a unique game as it was only available as a DS download play demo and was never available on an actual cartridge or for sale digitally. It was just a simple fishing game that would go away when you turned your DS off or after 12 hours have passed. Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness is a sequel to Pokemon Coliseum. However, if you catch a Pokemon in Pokemon Coliseum, transfer it over to Ruby and Sapphire, then transfer that Pokemon over to XD Gale of Darkness, the game will say that the Pokemon was met in a distant land, despite being originally met in the Ore region, the same region XD Gale of Darkness takes place in. There really isn't too much information out there on Pokemon Advanced Generation Pokemon Number Battle, but it was an educational game made by Sega that was a very simple puzzle game for children. Pokemon Troze is a puzzle game featuring Pokemon, however in Europe the game was called Pokemon Link. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Red Rescue Team, and Blue Rescue Team are paired spin-off games which isn't too common in Pokemon, with Red being on the Game Boy Advance and Blue being on the DS. They're essentially the same game still, and if you have the original Japanese release of Blue Rescue Team, it'll wipe the save data of any Game Boy Advance game in the GBA slot if it wasn't Red Rescue Team, which is quite the bummer. Pocket Monsters Advanced Generation Pokemon Super Drill, Let's Learn Numbers from 1 to 20, is quite the mouthful and yet another educational game made by Sega. It's one of the rarest Pokemon games in existence, with a collector on Reddit putting out a $1,000 bounty to the game because of how rare it is. Pokemon Ranger was originally called Pokemon Ranger The Road to Diamond and Pearl to hype up the release of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, but that subtitle was dropped early in development. Pokemate isn't exactly a game, but it was a mobile phone OS exclusive to Japan in 2006, developed by Square Enix, who've also made Final Fantasy. This was the first ever mobile Pokemon application, and it would be a long time before another one was released. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl implemented 5 new key items that weren't obtainable in Diamond and Pearl and weren't used until later games. The first one is the Members Card and the Oak's Letter, which was only obtainable in Platinum for event-only Pokemon, the Magma Stone, which was used for Pokemon Black and White 2, and the Red Chain and Azurflu, which were unobtainable and unused until the release of Pokemon Legends Arceus. Pokemon Battle Revolution was released in Japan in 2006, but at the 2009 Pokemon World Championships, where they battled on Pokemon Battle Revolution, you can see Lucas in his Platinum outfit, which wasn't in the original game, and this update was never released to the public. Intellectual Training, Drill Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Letter and Number Intelligence game is yet another Sega educational game released on the advanced Pico Beta this time, the updated version of the Sega Pico. It taught kids numbers and letters. Yeah, there's really not too much information on these Sega Pico games, so sorry for the cop-out facts on these. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness, released in Japan in September of 2007, and sold a combined 1,516,375 copies, with 805,418 of those copies being Time, and 710,957 of those copies being Darkness. And one of those copies of Time is actually in my background of my setup because I found it super cheap at a retro game store and thought it looked cool. Pokemon Batrio is another Japanese exclusive arcade machine, although this one is pretty popular, spawning many similar machines and spin-offs that have these tokens that you can use in the game, like these ones that I have for a later version of this type of game. They even had memory keys, which were physical keys you could purchase to keep track of your progression in the game. I really wish we had these type of machines outside of Japan, but for now, Japan gets all the cool Pokemon stuff. Super Smash Bros. Brawl introduced the most new playable Pokemon out of any Smash game with 4, those being Lucario, then Squirtle, Ivysaur, and Charizard on the Pokemon Trainer. Pokemon Ranger Shadows of Almia is the first sequel to Pokemon Ranger released in 2008, and Murph, one of the supporting characters, uses the phrase evolution, which is the first time that the evolution phrase has ever been used officially by Pokemon. Mine Pokemon Ranch was a downloadable only game for the Wii that was mostly just Pokemon Box but in Generation 4. You need to own Diamond or Pearl to play it, and IGN called it the ugliest Pokemon game to hit any video game system, although I personally kinda like how it looks. Pokemon Platinum is a slightly altered and enhanced version of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, with one of the earliest changes that you can see being how you pick your starter Pokemon. In Diamond and Pearl, you get ambushed by a wild Starly and have to fight it out with a starter Pokemon that you basically just steal, while in Platinum, you and Barry are given a starter by Professor Rowan, then you battle Barry. In Diamond and Pearl, the Starly that attacks you can be shiny, while in Pokemon Platinum, Barry's starter Pokemon can never be shiny, making shiny hunting a Sinnoh starter a bit less frustrating in Platinum version, although I say this as I'm currently about 10 months into trying to get a shiny Turtwig in Platinum. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky is an enhanced version of Explorers of Time and Darkness, making this the only enhanced third version of a Mystery Dungeon game. Pokemon Rumble is a WiiWare game that features toy Pokemon in a simple beat-em-up style of gameplay that I used to enjoy a lot when it first came out in 2009. They even released a board game based on Pokemon Rumble that came with these Pokemon cards based on the Rumble figures. These are now some pretty rare and sought after Pokemon cards, and I had them sitting unsleeved in a plastic bag for so many years because I had no idea how rare they are, but I have the full collection now. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Adventure Squad was a WiiWare Mystery Dungeon game exclusive to Japan. It used the same 3D models as Pokemon Rumble and let you even use your Nintendo DS as a controller. Heart Gold and Soul Silver were the first Pokemon games to be available in French in Canada, as previously Canada only had official releases in English. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Search for Pokemon Adventure in the Maze is another educational game developed by Sega. Like most of these Japanese exclusive educational games, there isn't much information on it, but it did have multiplayer, apparently. Pokepark Wii Pikachu's Adventure was the first Pokemon game released in Hong Kong officially, aside from Super Smash Bros. If that counts, but I guess we are counting it for this list, so I don't even know anymore. Pokemon Ranger Guardian Signs has a distinction between legendary Pokemon and rare Pokemon, with rare Pokemon later being known as mythical Pokemon. Pokemon Black and White were first revealed on Pokemon Sunday, a Japanese show about Pokemon, where they played the song Black or White by Michael Jackson multiple times throughout the program in reference to the game's titles. Pokemon Best Wishes Intelligence Training Pokemon Big Sports Meet is yet another Sega educational game about Pokemon. I'm getting real tired of these, but why were there so many? Like many previous educational games by Sega, it teaches kids how to read and write in hiragana, but it also teaches how to read and write in English, which is a first for these Sega games. Pokemon Trading Card Game Online is the now defunct online client for the Pokemon TCG, which was later replaced by Pokemon TCG Live. It was originally a browser-based Flash game before eventually becoming a free downloadable title. Learn with Pokemon Typing Adventure is another educational game, however this one's for the Nintendo DS and not a Sega system, and released outside of Japan in Europe and Australia, but never released in North America officially. It came with a wireless keyboard that you would connect up to your Nintendo DS, which is one of the strangest but coolest peripherals ever released for a Nintendo console. Pokemon 3D is a Pokédex app or game, sort of, on the Nintendo 3DS. It was the first Pokemon game released exclusively for the 3DS. Pokemon Say Tap was a Japanese exclusive mobile game, making it the first of many mobile Pokemon games. Also count Pokemate or Pokemate, which wasn't a game but it was a mobile release. Either way, Pokemon Say Tap is a rhythm game based on the trading card game. Pokemon Card Game How to Play DS is a game that's just a tutorial for how to play the Pokemon TCG on the Nintendo DS. It even allowed you to play against other players locally, although it was just a tutorial and not a full TCG game like the TCG games were on the Game Boy. Pokemon Rumble Blast was a sequel to Pokemon Rumble, and it was also the first Pokemon game with a physical release on the 3DS. Pokepark 2 Wonders Beyond was the last Pokemon game released on the Wii, and it's also the only Pokemon game on the Wii to be part of the 5th generation of Pokemon, releasing in Japan on November 12, 2011. Pokemon Conquest is the only spin-off Pokemon game that is DSi enhanced. Pokemon Black 2 and Pokemon White 2 feature every single gym leader up to Generation 5 except for Koga. Pokemon Dream Radar was a downloadable DS title that was mainly used to catch Pokemon and transfer over to your Generation 5 Pokemon game. It was the only way to get Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, Ho-Oh, and Lugia in a Dream Ball prior to Pokemon Sword and Shield. Pokemon Treta is a similar arcade game to Pokemon Batrio that was also exclusive to Japan. It released in 2012, but would get updates periodically and eventually included Mega Evolution after X and Y released. Pokédex 3D Pro is another Pokédex app for the 3DS, but this time it also released on iOS devices. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity was the first Pokemon game to ever receive DLC. Pokemon Rumble U was the first console Pokemon game to use toy-to-life figures, which fit in really nicely with Pokemon Rumble as the game is about Pokemon toys. Pokemon Treta Lab was a Pokemon Treta accessory for the 3DS. It was only supported for less than a year, with later Treta expansions being incompatible. Pokemon X and Y were the first games published by Nintendo that would have the same release date worldwide. Pokemon Bank is a storage system for the 3DS Pokemon games, however, you were unable to store the Cosplay Pikachu from Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, some Totem Pokemon, and fuse Necrozma forms in Pokemon Bank. Pokemon Battle Troze was a sequel to Pokemon Troze, but in Europe it was called Pokemon Link Battle. Pokemon Thieves and the 100 Pokemon was a Japanese exclusive downloadable title for the 3DS that was only available from June 5th, 2014 to September 30th, 2014. If you completed the game, you would get a code that you can transfer over to Pokemon X and Y for a Master Ball. Pokemon Art Academy was the first Pokemon game ever developed in the UK. Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS are the first Smash games to have playable Pokemon from more than 2 generations, with the introduction of Greninja as a playable character. Camp Pokemon was a mobile Pokemon game mainly targeted towards young kids where you collect pins of various Pokemon. When you receive a pin, it would say the name of the Pokemon's pin you received, but when you obtain a Mega Aggron pin, the name would just be blank. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire released on the 12th anniversary of Ruby and Sapphire's Japanese release date, except for in Europe where it was released a week later. Pokemon Shuffle is a puzzle game on the 3DS and mobile phones that features 802 obtainable Pokemon, making it the Pokemon game with the most obtainable Pokemon in it without having to rely on transferring over any Pokemon from other games or previous games. Pokemon Rumble World is the only Pokemon game to receive a digital-only release before having a physical release later on. The digital version was free, but the physical version included some things locked behind microtransactions. Learn Real English through Pokemon XY Translation Scope was an educational game for iOS devices in Japan that translated English text into Japanese. It allowed players to play Pokemon X and Y in English on their 3DS, then translate it to Japanese with their phone, although this feature didn't work with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Pokemon Jukebox was an Android-only Pokemon game that's not really a game, it just lets you play music. I'm using the word game very loosely in this video and going mostly by what Bulbapedia lists as a game, but I'm omitting some things that they list as games like these weird Pokemon TV apps that just let you watch the anime, and these strategy guide apps released on iOS since they're not actual games you could play. As for Pokemon Jukebox though, this was the first official international release of the Pokemon Red and Blue soundtrack. Dancing, Pokemon Band, was a Japanese exclusive rhythm game that only received one update to add Mewtwo as a playable character. Pokken Tournament is the only Pokemon game where the Japanese logo was used for all international releases. Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon has the most playable Pokemon out of any Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game with 20 playable Pokemon. Pokemon Picross is a puzzle game for the 3DS released in 2015, however a game called Pokemon Picross was announced in 1999 but never released. Pokemon Duel was an expansive mobile gacha game featuring digital figures you could battle with. These figures were based on a physical Pokemon figure system that released years prior, however Pokemon Duel was discontinued back in 2019. Pokemon Go used to work with the Apple Watch with an update in December of 2016, but that feature was later dropped in July of 2019, most likely in favor of things like the Pokeball Plus. Pokemon Ga Ole is another Pokemon arcade machine, but this one released in Japan, South Korea, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. It's similar to Pokemon Treta, but the discs used for it resemble cards more than any other similar Pokemon arcade machine like this one. Pokemon Sun and Moon were the first core series games to show NPCs sending out Pokemon in other Pokeballs besides the standard base Pokeball. Magikarp Jump is a mobile game where you collect various Magikarps and make them jump. The game even has Facebook connectivity so you can let all your Facebook friends know how good you are at making your Magikarp jump. Pokemon Playhouse was another mobile game targeted towards young kids on iOS and Android devices. Despite the game's earliest Android version being released on Android 3.0, the official website stated that it worked on Android versions 2.3 and above. Pokken Tournament DX is a port of Pokken to the Switch, and had some Switch exclusive characters like Decidueye, Aegislash, and Blastoise. If you put the box arts of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon together, you see Ultra Necrozma. In 2018, another Detective Pikachu game released for the 3DS as an upgraded version of the original, which also had an international release. It's essentially the same thing as the old version of the game that released earlier, however the new version was the last Pokemon game released for the 3DS. Pokemon Quest is a cute mobile game that also released on Nintendo Switch, although strangely, there are no Dark-type Pokemon in the game at all. Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee were the first main series games on the Nintendo Switch, however during development, they considered having Let's Go Psyduck instead of Let's Go Eevee. They decided against Psyduck though because it was also yellow just like Pikachu. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has an unused Dragonite model in it. Pokemon TCG Card Dex was a mobile app that let users view Pokemon cards. It was never released in the Russian language, but in the credits they credit somebody for translating the game to Russian. Pokemon Pass allows users to get QR codes for event Pokemon on their phone, but if a store does a promotion that's only in store, they still have to go to the physical store to get the code. The app even listed a Gigantamax Caparaja event that GameStop was supposed to have in 2020 but was later cancelled. Pokemon Rumble Rush was a short-lived mobile game based on the Pokemon Rumble series. It didn't even last a full year on iOS before being shut down, despite being a pretty solid game. Pokemon Masters is set to take place after each core series game, however Red is the only playable character from the core series games ever referenced to be a champion, even though all of these other characters are technically champions too. Pokemon Wave Hello is a game I never even knew existed, which I can say for a lot of games on this list, despite releasing relatively recently though in 2019. It was made to promote the Pixel 4 phone in collaboration with Google to demonstrate the phone's motion sense capabilities, but it was removed from the Google Play App Store in June of 2022. A few years ago, if you were to scan the box art of Pokemon Sword and Shield with Google Lens on your phone, it would play an animation over the box art or a short video, although this feature is no longer available. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX was the first remake of a Pokemon game that wasn't in the core series. In Pokemon Smile, your starter Pokemon isn't added to your Pokédex right away. Instead, you have to catch another version of that same Pokemon for it to be registered in your Pokédex. Pokemon Cafe Remix is a mobile game with a Switch port that even had a manga adaptation. Pokemon Mesostar is yet another arcade Pokemon game like Pokemon Tetra. It was initially planned to be released earlier in 2020 but got delayed due to COVID. Shroomish is shown off in footage for new Pokemon Snap, however it wasn't actually put into the game until the 2.0 update. Pokemon Unite was developed with a subsidiary of Tencent, a Chinese mobile gaming giant. However, the mobile version of Unite didn't release in China until November 2024, despite the mobile version of Unite releasing internationally elsewhere in 2021. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are the only mainline Generation 8 Pokemon games where the starter Pokemon can be shiny. Pokemon Legends Arceus is the only core series game that doesn't have a Master Ball or feature the playable character's mother. Pokemon TCG Live is the successor to Pokemon TCG Online, however it features less cards than the original Pokemon TCG Online app, with the Heart Gold and Soul Silver block of cards not even being in the game yet. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are the first core series games to include Tentacool and Geodude without Zubat, as previously if one of these Pokemon were in a core series game, so were the other two. Pokemon Sleep has no Pokemon from Generation 5 as of January 2025, which is the only region to be omitted. The strange thing about this is Generation 5 had their own features revolving around sleep with the Dream World. In Detective Pikachu Returns for the Switch, they reference a movie made about the R incident, which is the Detective Pikachu movie that actually released in 2019. Pokemon trading card game Pocket originally had an icon for the fairy type in the game files, despite the fairy type no longer being in the Pokemon trading card game as of the first Sword and Shield expansion set. No fairy type cards were ever added to Pocket, and it was removed in a later update. Pokemon Legends ZA is going to be the second Legends game released. Mega Evolution will be featured in the game after not appearing in the main series since the Let's Go games released about 7 years prior. And that's a fact for every Pokemon game, at least the games released on console, phone, or an arcade machine. I didn't count some random apps that weren't quite games, nor things like the Pokewalker, which are their own standalone thing. If I missed any games, let me know in the comments down below, as I learned a lot about Pokemon games that I never even knew about by making this video. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to. Have a great rest of your day. I'll see y'all next time, and bye bye.